Notifications are a critical part of the apps that we love to use. And while some give you a little bit of control over how we actually get those notifications, others give you really nice granular control, allowing you to specify what gets sent and where. But you don't need a huge team at Facebook or Twitter in order to do that kind of thing. We can use services like Knock, where with its powerful APIs and workflows, we can really get that granular control inside of our own applications. So we're going to see how we can integrate Knock inside of a Next.js app, where we're going to use it to set up workflows to not only send email notifications, but create a really nice interactive in-app feed where we can see that once we get our notifications, we have the ability to manage them as a user right inside of our dashboard. Shout out to Knock for sponsoring this video. Let's dig in and see how easy it is to get set up. To see how this works, I created a basic invoicing application that allows me to create invoices and manage their status. For a database, I use Neon, and for authentication, I use Clerk, which you can really sub in any authentication service that you want, but we're going to see in this video specifically how you're able to integrate with Clerk. Now, if you want to follow along, I had this demo invoicing starter, which really just walks you through setting up this same invoicing application that uses Clerk and Neon database. But again, you can really use whatever service you want in order to spin up your own application. Now, as far as notifications go, I have really two events that I want to send notifications around, where one is going to be around invoice creation. So once that invoice is created, I want to send a notification about that. Now, the other one is going to be when notifications are updated. So if, for instance, I have an invoice and I change the status to void, I want to make sure that a notification is sent out for that. Or otherwise, if a notification is sent to paid, I want maybe a slightly different notification to be set up. One of the powerful things about Doc is I can control exactly what gets sent and where, but also based off of different contextual states. So I can send a different notification if it's paid versus a different status. So we're going to see how we can set that up. Now, the very first thing you want to do is sign up for your free Knock account. But once you're actually signed up and signed in, you're going to see a list of steps that you can use in order to get started. But before we dive in, we want to kind of think about the different concepts here, where a lot of this is going to focus around the idea of workflows. And you can kind of think of it like a flow chart, where we're going to have a trigger for that workflow, which could be just an in-app trigger that we fire ourselves. And then once you're inside of that workflow, we can control what gets sent and where, whether we want to send an in-app or email notification, whether we want to send a specific message based off of that contextual data. It gives us a lot of control over what gets sent and where, like we were talking about before. But ultimately, in order to send those notifications, such as in-app and email, we're going to have different channels that we send those through, where the email notification, the email provider is going to be a channel, or even in-app is going to be a specific channel. So that means the very first thing that we want to do is create a new channel. So you can either click this create a channel button, or we can head up to integrations where we have the channels tab where we see that we already have a default in-app feed. Now we're going to come back to using this later, but we're going to start off by creating a new email channel. So we're going to click this create channel button, and we can see that we have a lot of options for the different email providers that we have available to us. Now we can also create a new in-app notification feed, maybe have different use cases, such as one is for marketing notifications, another one is for in-app notifications for those invoices. But we also have different notification types such as push notifications, SMS, chat, where we can even use webhooks if we want. But we're going to just start off with these email notifications. And if we scroll down, I'm going to walk through how we can set this up with Resend, but you can really use any of those email providers that you prefer. So I'm going to click next, and now we need to enter a name and a key. Now Knock is going to default add those values for you. I'm just going to use the defaults for mine, but again, if you have different providers, maybe you want to have a specific use case labeling for this, but I'm going to use the defaults for now, and I'm going to click create. Now, once we create our new channel, we're going to be dropped into the channel configuration page where we can see that we have two different environments that we can configure, where we have our development environment and we have our production environment. But what we're going to want to do, we're going to start off with the development, where if I click manage configuration, we have a bunch of different settings that we can provide. But what we're going to care about right now is providing our API key, our from email address, as well as our from name. Now, this is your first time using Resend or any email provider, really. You need to make sure that you have a verified domain so that you can actually send it using that email provider. But once you have that verified domain, I'm going to head over and Resend to my API keys page, where I'm going to go ahead and create a new API key. I'm going to call this my invoices, or you can really use whatever name makes sense for your application. I'm going to leave it as full access and all domains, and I'm going to go ahead and click add. Now, we can see that once we have that, we're going to get this API key, which I'm going to go ahead and copy to my clipboard, and then over back on my Knock tab, I'm going to paste that under my API key field, where then I'm going to be able to set up my from email address as well as my from name. Now for my from name, let's say my invoices. So it's my invoices application. And as far as the email goes, I have one verified email domain, and that's going to be test.spacejelly.dev. So I know I can use something like knock at test.spacejelly.dev. And that's going to allow me to send those emails using the API key, the email address, and the from name from my resend account. But then I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. I'm going to click update settings, where we're dropped back into our channel configuration page, where now we can see that we have our development environment configured, but we don't have our production environment configured. Now, in my case, I'm going to use the same API key for both my development and production. But in your case, maybe you want to have a development and a production, different API keys, different email addresses, so that you have a good way of testing between the two. But for now, for this tutorial, I'm just going to use the same thing. So what I can do is I can head over to this copy from button, and I'm going to go ahead and simply copy my production environment from my development environment. I'm going to go ahead and confirm that, and we can see now production for me is configured. But now we have our channel configured, we can actually get started to creating our first workflow. So I'm going to head over to the workflows section inside of my sidebar, where we're greeted with the ability to create our first workflow. So I'm going to click create workflow, and we can see that we're able to name this. Now, this is probably making sense to name it based off of the event that we're going to want to trigger this for. Or maybe you have different events that trigger one type of or workflow. So you want to really think about the use case around this workflow. But in my case, I want to send it based off of when an invoice is created. So I'm going to call this invoice created. And we can see that the key automatically fills out based off of that about the name that we provided. But I'm going to go ahead and just remove these extra dashes just to make it a little bit cleaner. But then I'm going to go ahead and click create. Now, similar to when we create a new channel, we're going to be dropped into our new workflow page. And if we start to scroll down, we can see that we have this step section, where this is going to be that workflow that we talked about before that's going to look kind of like a flowchart, where we have a specific trigger that's going to trigger all the different cases that we want to configure to. Now, if we go ahead and click this edit steps button, we can start to see we have this editor, where we have a bunch of steps on the side here that represent all the different things that we can do. Now, we can see that we have our email provider there. We even have that in-app provider, so we can really configure what we get sent and where. Now, each of these blocks are going to be considered steps. So every time we add this, we're going to be adding a new step. So let's add our first step, where I'm going to go ahead and we can either click or drag our email provider over into our workflow. Now, with that dragged over, we're going to be able to see that we have a bunch of settings for that particular step that we can now take, where the one that we're going to focus on is this message template. So I'm going to go ahead and click edit template, where this is going to give us the ability to completely customize the notification that's actually sent. So we can see here, just like a normal email, we have our subject line, but we can also create our body. So let's start off with the subject line. I'm going to say a new invoice was created, and let's drag over a different block that we can use in order to start to add some text. And I'm going to use a markdown component in here, where we can really configure dynamic values as we're sending and setting up this email. Now, because I had this set up before, I'm going to go ahead and paste in what I'm going to send here. I'm going to pop this out to make it a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to paste this in, and we can see, hey, recipient name. I just grabbed this that was already there in the first place, but then I'm going to change this to a new invoice was created. And I'm going to also include all the different details that we're going to set along for this. So in my invoicing app, I'm going to create an email, or a name, an email, a description for the invoice so we know what it was about, as well as a value for that invoice. But once you're ready configuring your email template, whether you want to use Markdown or you can even use HTML, I'm going to go ahead and click done, and we can see that we get a little preview of it. Now, we don't have any data in here yet. We haven't sent any data into the system for it to kind of have an idea of what that looks like, but we know now that we have this little preview. So I'm going to go ahead and click save changes, and then I'm going to exit out of my workflow, where once we have our changes for the different steps or the different templates that we want it to make it to our workflow, we're going to ultimately commit these changes to our workflow environment. Now, you can kind of think of this like GitHub or Git, where you have your main branch and you have the changes set up that you're going to commit to that main branch. It's the same concept, where we're creating new changes to our main branch with this new step and with our messaging template, so that we can now commit them and have them merged in. So if we go up to this commit to a development button, we can see our change set for this commit, where again, similar to Git and GitHub, we can see the green represents all the additions that we're going to add. So we just created this new message template. So it's going to basically be all additions, and we can see how it's even set up and ultimately added as a step into our workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and click commit to development, where now our basic workflow is set up in order to just simply send a notification whenever this workflow is actually triggered. Now we're going to get into some more advanced use cases here in a second, but before we do that, let's actually get this integrated into our application and set up so that we can see this email notification actually sent out. But before we do that, we already committed these changes to our development environment, but we have one last step as we want to actually get these pushed out to our production environment. Now, as you can imagine, we have those different environments for reasons where we want to do a lot of our work on our development environment to make sure that we're testing these things and making sure they're working properly. But in our case, I'm just going to test this out for this tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and head back out. I'm going to head over to this commits tab where we can see that, kind of similar to GitHub, we have this idea of commits where we can now promote these changes to our production environment. So we can even see here, Colby Fayak updated the workflow. So now I want to go ahead and promote these changes to production. So I'm going to go ahead and click that button. I'm going to confirm. And we can see, just as if we were merging a pull request, these changes have now been pushed out to production for my Knock account. But okay, now let's actually get this integrated into our application. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the docs so we can kind of follow along with this, where if we head up over to the SDKs up inside of this APIs and SDKs menu, we can see that we have a lot of different SDKs that we can actually use in order to integrate with Knock. But of course, we're going to use the Node SDK as we're inside of our Knock, or rather Next.js environment, where we're going to be able to use Node. And we can see the very first thing that we need to do is npm install Knock Labs Node. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go ahead and paste that right into my terminal. And once that's installed, we can head back over and we can see that we want to configure two different environment variables in order to get this set up with our Knock account, where we can see we have an API key and we have a signing key. Now, I'm going to name these a little bit differently inside of our Next.js application, but just to get started, let's go ahead and copy these so we have a place to start. And then we're going to want to open up our .env.local, where we're going to go ahead and paste those keys at the bottom. And we can see I got rid of my other keys just so you can't see them, but we can see that we have our Knock API key. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename that one to next public API key. And then for the Knock signing key, I'm going to name that to a similar pattern that we see for other environment variables, where instead of Knock signing key, I'm just going to call this Knock API secret. Now, heading to the Knock dashboard, we're going to be able to find this under the developer section in the sidebar, where I'm going to go ahead and select API keys, and we see we have both our secret key and our public key readily available. So I'm going to go ahead and first copy my public key. I'm going to paste this in as my key, and I'm not hiding it because I'm going to delete these later. And I'm going to also copy my secret key and paste that one as well. But now that we have that set up, let's actually trigger our first workflow. Now, inside the application, the way that I currently have this set up is I'm using server actions in order to trigger the different updates. Where if we go into source app, where I have this actions.tsx file, I have two specific functions or server actions that I'm using, where I have create invoice and I also have update status. Now, to start, since this is invoice created, we're going to first focus on this create invoice function or server action. Now, inside of the application, the way this works is I have this create invoice page where once I fill out this form, including the name, email, value, and description, I use that server action to take over that form submission, where I send that information to the database to create a new row, where that's where we're going to be able to trigger that workflow after we know that it's been successfully created. Now, as the name implies, we're using server actions. So that's why we're able to use the Node SDK for here, since we're working on this server. But in order to use the SDK, let's now get it set up and import the module. So we can see here that we just need to import the Knock module from the package, where I can then set up a new client using the API key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And at the top of my file, I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. I like to import these ones at the top for the different external packages. We can see that we're setting up our new Knock instance, but then I'm going to import my environment variable. So I'm going to say process.env, and that's going to be my API key, or my API secret rather. So it's going to be Knock API secret. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this to Knock just so it's a little bit shorter. But now we have access to the client so that we can actually trigger these workflows. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to where I'm going to actually send this, and I'm going to send it right after I have this database insertion. So I'm going to actually use the invoice path. So I'm going to put it right underneath. And if we look back inside of the SDK documentation, we can see the way that this is going to work is we're going to use this Knock workflows trigger method, where we're going to be able to pass in the ID of the workflow that we want to trigger. We can pass in some data along with it. And we're going to also pass in what's called recipients, where we can pass in who we want these notifications to be sent to. Now, in my case, I want to send it to the user account that's actually creating the invoice. That way we can always keep those notifications present. Imagine if you have a bunch of different accounts under one organization and you want to make sure that everybody's kind of notified of that new invoice creation, we're able to do so. But again, we're going to be able to send this to multiple recipients, which we're going to see later. But for now, for this one, we're going to send this to the user that's based off of the account that's actually logged in. So we can see that we have const user equals current user at the top. This is going to be coming from clerk. So we're going to be able to use this user information from clerk in order to send that notification. And then what we're going to send is all this information about the invoice that was created. And that's all going to come from the form where the server action is going to allow us to get all those different input fields and then send that along as our contextual data. So after the row is actually inserted successfully, I'm going to go ahead and now trigger that workflow. So await knock.workflows.trigger, where I'm going to pass in my invoice created ID, and then I'm going to pass in a second argument that's going to include the data of all that information. So I'm going to say data is a new object, where I'm going to pass in the name, the email, the description, and the value of that. And then I want to define a second property where that's going to be my recipients. And that's going to be an array, again, because we can send to multiple recipients. That's also going to be a new object. Where here, I'm going to want to specify an ID. I'm also going to specify a name, and I'm also going to specify an email. Now, all these values are going to come from clerk. We're going to basically keep in sync the clerk user ID and the knock ID, as knock actually recommends to use your auth provider's ID, unless of course you're managing these completely separately in a database, where maybe you have the database user ID as the main mechanism for all your different services. So maybe in that event, you'd use that. But since we're using our clerk auth ID as the source of truth for this, we're going to use the clerk ID from our user. So in this case, because we have our user being imported at the top, we have all this information right inside of this user object. So for the ID, I'm going to specify user.id. For the name, it's going to be user.first name. And just in case first name isn't actually defined, I'm going to actually add an empty string just in case. And then for our email, it's going to be a little bit more complicated when working with Clerk, because what it's going to do is it's going to give you a list of email addresses, because your account might have multiple email addresses, and then it's going to be giving you an ID for your primary email address. So we're going to look for that primary email address out of our Clerk user and use that. Now I'm going to go ahead and just paste this in rather than trying to type this all out, but we can see here what we're going to do is we're going to look through that array of email addresses coming from our Clerk user, and we're going to try to find the ID that matches our primary email address ID. And ultimately, once we find that, we return the email address associated with that. So now we have our recipient, which is going to be our clerk user, which is going to pass along the ID, name, and email. But now we have all of our information set up to actually trigger this workflow. We have our data, which is going to be all of our invoice data, which is going to be our contextual data for the actual notification that we're sending. We have our recipient, which again is our clerk user, and we have our ID that's going to be associated with, which in this instance is going to be our invoice created workflow. Now, just as a quick reminder, if you're wondering where I got that ID from, if you don't remember from before, it's under our invoice created workflow where we set up that original key, which is just simply invoice created. So you can always find that on side of your workflow details page. But now let's actually give this a try, where all we need to do in order to trigger this is fire that create invoice function or server action, which gets triggered whenever we submit a new invoice form. So let's submit one. So over on the invoice form, I'm going to specify my billing name as Colby Fayok. For the billing email, I'm just going to send my hello@colbyfayok.com. For the value, let's just say 123456. And for the description, this is my first invoice. We actually have a couple others, but this is my first for the video, right? So let's go ahead and click submit, where we can see that I successfully created that new invoice. Where I'm not going to show you my full inbox to see it in the list, but we can see that we should get a new email that says a new invoice was created. And that includes all of our different metadata or details about the invoice, including our name, email, description, and value. Now, if we head back to our details page, we can even see that we get our logs based off the different events that were sent, where we can see that there was a post to this API endpoint, which was essentially us triggering that workflow. Now, another thing that's interesting, if we head over and click on the users section, we should actually be able to see our new user synced to our Knock account, where I just hid this with stars, but you should be able to see the normal email address if you're sending this. But we can see that we have our new user inside of our Knock account, which is going to be that recipient. So now every time we trigger a workflow, that user data is going to be synced with our Knock account, because the Knock user ID is going to be the same as our clerk ID or whatever authentication provider that we're using. Now, this is important because as we think about all these different notification types, all these different workflow steps, and how we really want to send these granular messages, we really want to make sure that all this user information is synced into our account so that we have the right contact information, we have the right contextual information about that account, whether it's making sure that their name is right based off of the clerk account information. So we really want to make sure that we're sending this with the right and most up-to-date data that we have. Now, a quick look into how this works as far as syncing the user data to Knock. The way that we sent this data along with our trigger is we're using what's called inline identification, where there's different ways that you can send that data and sync it to Knock, where this is passing it along with our trigger so that we can sync it right with that action to make sure as we send that notification, it's going to be completely up to date. Now, this isn't always possible. This isn't always the case. Maybe I don't have all this user information. Maybe I just have the ID. I don't have the name and the email. But if my Knock account already has that name and email, I don't necessarily need to send it. So whether that's saving a few bytes on the API request or just maybe the convenience of not having it there instead of making a new database request, I can make sure that I'm only passing the ID of who I want to send this to make sure that it's still going to be sent based off of the current data that Knock has. But the thing is, we have an alternate option where we have this inline identification. We can also just trigger this manually through the identification endpoint where we can always sync that data, which we're going to see in a little bit when we look at webhooks. But now that we have that set up and we're syncing it alongside of our workflow trigger, we have the emails working properly. Let's now try to add that in-app notification feed. Now, in addition to the Node SDK that we're using, Knock also has a React SDK. So we're going to head over to the docs and I'm going to look up React notification feed, where we can see that we have actually React Native and normal React. We're going to use the web version of React, where we can see building notifications feeds with React, where this is going to be the example that I'm going to really base this off of. So you have a starting point if you want the written version, or also I have a tutorial in the description if you want to use that. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually install that Knock Labs React SDK package. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go ahead and paste it into my terminal. And once that's installed, heading back over to that documentation page, we can see under this section, we actually have a pre-built component that we're able to really easily copy into our application. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So to start with this, I'm going to copy this entire snippet. I'm going to actually just use this copy button at the top here. And inside my app where I manage my different components, I'm going to create a new component called notification feed.tsx. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. Now let's take a look at what we just pasted in. I'm going to go ahead and hide the sidebar where we can see we're importing the state and refs from React. I'm importing a bunch of components from the React package from Knock. I'm importing some styles to make sure that we're able to actually get some of those base functionality that we'll see in a second here. But also we can see the rest of it set up where we have some of the state set up, the ref for the actual component. We can see that we're creating a Knock provider, which is going to be where we're going to configure our API key. We're also going to configure our user ID, which is going to come from our clerk user. We then have our feed provider, which is going to be associated with that in-app feed that we saw earlier when we were creating our email channel. But then finally, we have our icon button, which is going to be that little bell that we saw, as well as the actual feed, where when we click that bell, we had that little popover that included all of our different notifications. So now we just got to make a few tweaks to this, but let's get started by configuring and making sure that we have all the environment variables set up for this particular component. Now, because we were using public environment variables, the first thing I need to do is for this API key, I need to make sure that this is next public Knock API key. But we never set up a Knock feed channel ID. So let's set this up now. So inside of my .env.local, I'm going to paste in that Knock feed channel ID, and I need to make that a next public Knock feed channel ID, of course. And we're going to find this feed channel ID inside of the integration section, where we're going to head over to in-app, where we can see that we get this channel ID right at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this value and then paste this in as my ID. Now, I'm sure we can add some environment variable validation or something using TypeScript, but for now, since we just want to make these API key and feed ID fields or props happy, so I'm just going to simply wrap them as a string just to make TypeScript happy here. But then we also want to add our user ID, which is going to come from clerk, of course. So to do this, we're going to use the use user hook from clerk. So at the very top, I'm going to import use user from at clerk Next.js, which again, if you're using a different auth provider, you just want to use whatever package or APIs that you have available in order to get that user ID. But ultimately I'm using clerk. So I'm going to say const user is equal to use user, if I can type, and then I'm going to say, if I don't have a user, I'm just going to return because we do need to have our user in order to make this work. But then if I do have the user, I'm going to make sure that this is user.id. And as one last thing, since we are inside of the Next.js app router, and this of course is going to be a client component, let's go ahead and add use client at the top of our component, just so we can make sure we're opting in as a client component. And then finally, I'm going to rename this to notification feed, and I'm going to make sure I'm going to export my default notification feed. Make sure I spelled default correctly here. But now let's actually import this into our application. So I'm going to import this into the header file, where we can see that inside of my header, I already have this user button. So I'm going to just add it right next to it. But first, I'm going to import my notification feed component. And then right above my user button, I'm going to go ahead and import that notification feed. Now, quickly back inside the notification feed component, I did notice that I never updated this knock feed channel ID to next public. So make sure that you update that as you're working with your notification feed component. Now, before we actually try to trigger that notification, we have one important step where we have our in-app channel actually configured, but we never added it to our workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to the workflow section. And if I select my invoice created, we need to actually configure this workflow where currently all it's doing is sending that email. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to edit steps, where inside of here, not only am I going to send to resend, I'm going to also click or drag my in-app notification. And similar to when we set up that email notification, I want to now set up my in-app notification. And for this one, we can just say a new invoice was created, exclamation point. Now this one, you probably don't want to include as much contextual information as the other one, as there's not as much room that you're going to have for that particular popover feed. So I'm going to go ahead and click save changes. Like before, I'm going to go back. I'm going to commit this to development. We can see the actual change set for this in-app notification feed. So I'm going to go ahead and commit that. And again, we want to publish this now to production. We're going to head back to workflow steps, going to my commits, and I'm going to promote these changes to production. But if we head back to the application, we can now see that we have that bell icon. And if we click it, we get our notification feed. And of course, we don't have any notifications yet. We haven't triggered anything, but now let's actually trigger one so we can see it show up. Now, of course, we can do that by creating a new invoice. So I'm going to head back over to the invoices list page. I'm going to go ahead and create a new invoice. I'm going to call this one Colby2. I'm going to paste in that email address. And this one, it's going to be 09, well, 0 doesn't make sense, of course, but 9876.54. And I'm going to say this is my second invoice, of course. So let's go ahead and submit that second invoice. But if we give it a second, we should now see that we have a new notification right at the top with that bell icon. If I hide myself, if we click that, we can see a new invoice was created. Perfect. And we can even see that our email notification still pops into our inbox. Now, one of the nice things about Knock is we didn't actually have to go through that invoice creation in order to just simply test our notifications. If we head over into our workflow details page, we can see at the top here, we have this run a test button. So if I click this, we can see that we have a bunch of configuration that we can set up in order to send a test notification. So if we select a recipient, that's going to be all of our users that are actually synced to Knock. Now I'm not going to select that because it's my personal email address, but if you click into that, you're going to be able to see all those users and select whatever one you want to test it to, whether it's your personal user or somebody else that's inside of that environment. Now, we're not going to get into actor and tenant for this particular workflow or this demo, but we can see that under data, we can fill out all that information that we would normally get when we're actually sending those. So how about description, test description, email, test@test.com, name, test name, value 1234 to 56, and variable key, we can just leave that as is. But now after I'm going to go ahead and select my email address, and then I'm going to click run a test. Let's go ahead and actually click run a test. We should see that test email come through, and we can see back inside the application, if I click the notification bell, we can see a new invoice was created. Now let's go into a more advanced use case for workflows where maybe I want to have conditional statements where I want to have different branches based off of contextual information over what message I send or who I send this to. Now I'm going to focus this around invoice updates where we can see that I can change the status of this update. And if I change it to paid, if I change it to void, I want to send different notifications based off of what that status is. And I want to send them both to the person who's actually creating the invoice, as well as the person that the invoice is created for. So let's first head back into Knock, where I'm going to create a new workflow. I'm going to call this invoice updated. And I'm going to get rid of those extra dashes. I'm going to create my new workflow. And we can see just like before, we have our new workflow, but I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to go ahead and click edit steps, where I'm going to add the same things as I did before. I'm going to add my email. I'm going to add a new message template for that. I'm just going to paste some of this stuff in to go through it a little bit quicker, but for the subject line, I'm going to have an invoice was updated. For the message block, I'm going to add some markdown. I'm going to paste this in. Let's pop this out just so you can see it, but it's going to give the name, and an update was made to the following invoice, where I'm going to have their name, a URL to that invoice, and then for a specific value was changed to the status. And that status is going to be the key identifier of what's actually changed within that invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and click done. I'm going to head back out. I'm going to save changes and then head back out to my steps. And then I'm going to also make sure that I add my in-app notifications, where for this, I'm going to edit my message template. I'm going to go ahead and paste this in, and it's going to be pretty similar, but it's going to be basically plain text where it's going to say names, value, and the status update. I'm going to go ahead and click save changes. And just to make sure that we're clear, this is basically doing the exact same thing that we just did, only it's going to be for this new invoice updated workflow. Now let's actually make sure that this is working and triggering based off of the status updates though. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this to development. We can see the change sets. I'm going to commit that. I'm going to make sure that I promote this to production, just like we did before for the created workflow. Back inside of my Next.js actions, let me get rid of the sidebar. I'm going to basically do the same exact thing that I did for my create invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this trigger statement. Let's head back down to the update status server action, which is going to fire whenever I submit that change of the status. And then I'm going to make sure that I have that underneath, where we're going to, again, do a similar thing. We're going to pass in that contextual data, and we're going to pass it to the user, the current user of the application. Now, of course, I don't have all this information here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually grab it from this update, where I don't have any of the information when this update status is fired. I only have the form data of the status and the ID. But what I can do is I can get it when it's returned from my database update. So I'm going to say constant results is equal to that database update. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and spread out the first result of that. Now that's specific to the use case. I'm using Neon and Drizzle in order to do that. So it's going to potentially look a little bit different depending on the database and the ORM that you're potentially using. But for my use case, I can simply spread out that first result. But then I can go ahead and get rid of that name, email, and description and value variables alone. Now, something that you can do in the future that we're not going to cover here is you can also send in some additional contextual data, such as maybe you want to have a link inside of your notifications for the URL that's getting updated. So maybe I have my invoices here and I have my results ID so that you can actually pass that along. But again, we're not going to cover that for now. Let's just pass through those results. But finally, I need to also update that workflow ID. So mine's going to be invoice updated. And now let's actually give this a try. So I'm going to go ahead and change my status. Let's change it to open. And we should now see that our notification first pops into our notification feed. Let's click that. I can see Colby's invoice was changed to open. Perfect. I can also see that my email arrived and I have my update invoice template where similarly, Colby 2's invoice of the number was changed to open. Perfect. Now, the first big difference that we're going to do with this workflow is not only do we want to send it to the updates to the person who created the invoice, we want to send it to the person who the invoice was created for, the billee for this. So we're going to send it to both the person who created invoice and the person who's being billed. Now, the way that this is going to work is we're going to pass them as a second recipient because the recipients is going to be everybody we're going to want to send these notifications to. So I'm going to go ahead and add a second object for the recipient. And now we're going to go ahead and fill each of these out where we're going to come back to the ID in a second here. But the name, we know that the name is going to come from the actual invoice contextual data. So I'm going to say results 0 name, and we're going to have the email that's going to come from the same location. So we have our email here. But then we want to have ID, which is a little bit tricky because we don't have an ID associated with this. Maybe in the future in your application, maybe you create a new user inside a clerk or inside of your database for every single person that's created an invoice for. But in my case, I'm not going to create a new user for this person. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a dynamic ID for this where I'm going to say payee. And what I'm going to actually do is associate it with the invoice itself. So every single invoice will have somebody associated with it, which is going to be the person who's being invoiced, and that ID is going to be specific to that invoice. So I'm going to say results ID as that identifier. And again, this is important because we need to make sure that this ID is going to be the same every time we have some kind of interaction. So that's why we're using the payee, because we always know that the payee is going to be the same person, and then based off of the ID that we use from the invoice itself. Now, this one's going to be a little bit trickier to test, especially if you're using the same email address for both the account that you logged into as well as the one that you're actually billing. So when you're testing, it probably makes sense to try to use a separate email address that's going to deliver to either a different inbox or one that's going to still be able to route into the inbox that you're testing with. But I'm going to head back into the application and I'm going to go ahead and change the status to, let's change this one to void. And we can already see that we got our in-app notification for our original user. I got my email notification at me. We can see that it says me. That's going to be the user that I'm logged into. But then we can scroll down in my list here and we can see that I also got my email from the person who's being billed, which in this case, I use my hello@colbyfayok.com in order to represent the person that's being invoiced. Now, this is great. They're sending to both users, but I think I want to change the messaging a little bit differently based off of who's actually receiving that. Now, heading back into our workflow editor, I'm going to come down here and go to edit steps. What we're going to do now is we're going to use this branch feature where it does what it sounds like, where it's allowing us to create different branches based off of something that occurs or some kind of contextual data. So I'm going to click or drag this into my workflow. We can immediately see that it created these two different branches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start to drag these up into one of the different branches. Now, these branches in my use case are going to represent the person who's getting invoiced and who's creating the invoice. So let's call the person who's getting invoiced the payee and the person who's creating the invoice the user, as they're the logged in user. So I'm going to name these branches just so that we can visualize this. So we have our payee branch and we have our else statement, which is going to be our user. And the way that we're going to actually identify this, we can see once we have the branch selected, we can start to configure the condition that's going to represent the if else statement. Now for the payee, if we remember, we added that string of payee in the front of their ID. We're just to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. We can see we call this payee underscore and the ID of the invoice. So what we can do is under condition type, we can select recipient. And then for the recipient property, we can select ID. So now we can match something based off of the value of that recipient ID, which is going to contain that string of payee. So we can say, does it contain payee? And that's going to be our condition. So we're basically saying if recipient ID contains payee, they're going to be represented as that payee. Otherwise, we can consider them as a user. Now, there's of course other ways that you can represent this. Maybe you have a user role or something that's representing the type of person that they are inside of the data that you're storing. But in my use case, I don't really have a different way of recognizing that inside of the recipient, at least for this tutorial. So this is going to be how we're going to represent our payee versus our user. But now that we have these different branches, we can start to customize what we send to each of the different people based off of who they are. Where here we have our branch or our steps rather under the payee, and the ones that we had before are probably the ones that we want to actually send to the user. So what we can do is we can also clone this step. And what I'm going to do is drag that over to our user because we want to make sure that we keep those same steps. I'm going to go ahead and clone both of them. I'm going to drag this one over, and we can also start to rename these different steps so that we know who they're sending to. So email user, I can also name this in-app user, where then we also have our email payee and our in-app or payee rather. But now also what we want to do is configure the different messages based off of who we're sending this to. So like before, we can open up our message template. And here I'm just going to make some subtle changes where instead of an invoice was updated, I'm going to say your invoice was updated because it's only going to be that single invoice that we're updating this for. And then inside of the markdown block, let me pop this open. We can paste this in and I'm going to just simply say your invoice for a specific value was changed to a specific status. I'm going to click done. I'm going to click save changes and head back to the workflows where I'm going to do the same exact thing for the in-app notification. And I'm going to say your invoice for that value was changed to status. I'm going to click save changes. And now we can see that inside of our new branch, whenever that's triggered, if they're a payee versus a user, they're going to get a little bit different wording based off of who they are. So I'm going to go ahead and commit this to development. We can see all of our change sets like we usually do. I'm going to head back out to my commits. I'm going to promote these to production. And now let's actually test these changes. So heading back to the application, we can see that this is going to be my logged in user that's going to make these changes. And then we have the billing email. Like we saw, we got those two separate emails, only one in-app notification since we only had that one in-app. I probably didn't need to create that extra step, but we can still see that we're going to get those two separate emails. So I'm going to go ahead and change the status. Let's change this back to open. We can already see my in-app notification pop in, but let's check our email where we can see the user email sent where it still says an invoice was updated to the following invoice. So that works properly. But now I got a separate email to that hello@colbyfayoc.com, which is the person being invoiced, where the wording is just a little bit different, where it's your invoice for that value was changed to open. We can see even the title, or the subject rather, was also changed based off of that message that we sent. Now, like I mentioned, we probably don't need the in-app for the payee because we're never actually going to have it in-app for that payee, at least inside of the tutorial that I'm working through. But if you have in-app, maybe you want your users to log in, you can certainly have some kind of mechanism around where if they log in, they're going to be able to get those same in-app notifications. Maybe they have to log in to pay the invoice, for instance. But let's take this even a step further. Currently, what's happening is whenever we trigger this workflow, we're sending those status updates, whatever they are, to both the user and the payee. But maybe I don't always want to send the update status to the payee. Maybe I only want to change it if it's marked as paid, such as maybe I don't want to send uncollectible, or maybe I don't want to send void to the, or maybe void, but maybe I only want to send paid specifically to the person who's being invoiced. I don't want to send all of them. So we can set this up so that we have another condition so that maybe we check the status, and if the status is paid, then we send it to the payee. Otherwise, we only send these updates to the user. So I'm going to hop in here and I'm going to create another branch, and I'm going to create this branch above my existing one. Now let's rename this one just so that we kind of have an idea when we're looking at this what it is. I'm going to say this payee versus user. You can see that I've done this before, but then I'm going to move this entire one under one of the first branches just so that we can start working through this. So this other branch, let's rename this. This is going to be, is it paid? Question mark, capital P. And now we need to create the branch logic to determine if it's going to be a status of paid or not. So we can call the first conditional of paid, and then our default is going to be not paid. And for this one, we're going to use the contextual data. So we're going to use that data object. And inside there, we're going to look for this status. So we're going to say, is the invoice status a particular value, which in this case, we want to check if it's paid. So I'm going to say is equal to, and then I'm going to select my paid. We can see that I've done this before, and then I'm going to click add condition. So now we're simply checking, is the status paid? If it is paid, we're going to go through this workflow. Otherwise, if it's not paid, we're going to go through this other workflow. So now let's configure the notifications that we're actually sending. Now, when I'm sending these, I ultimately want to send a message to the user, the one who created the invoice, no matter what. But I can still change what the message is that I'm actually sending. Sending an update as opposed to maybe something more exciting, such as an invoice was paid, is going to be a good way to craft a custom message. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clone these steps like I did before, just to make sure that we can use that existing messaging. So let's move this over here for not paid. I'm going to also clone the in-app notification there, pass it over here, but let's start working on the message templates here before we work on that other branch. Where for my payee, let's go to the message template. Let's say your invoice was paid, exclamation point, and your invoice for value was paid, exclamation point. We can save the changes. And now let's do the same thing for our user email. We can select it. An invoice was paid, an update to the following. We can also probably get rid of this update line and just say the invoice for value was paid, exclamation point, save changes, head back, do the same thing to the in-app user or in-app workflow, was paid, save changes. So now what we're basically going to do is whenever we detect that it is paid, we're going to say your invoice was paid versus an invoice was paid, but we're going to be more specific about that messaging as it's a little bit more exciting. But now let's work on the not paid workflow, where we still want to be able to represent whether somebody was actually a payee versus a user. So we can similarly clone this step. So I'm going to clone the branch that we have here, and I'm going to go ahead and move that over to my other branch here under not paid, where we can still see that this is still going to be our payee versus user. So I don't need to name this completely separately. But when we have our payee, if it's not a paid status, I don't even want to send anything to the payee at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. But we can see that we still have those invoice update messages here. I'm going to go ahead and just clean this up so that we don't have those ones here. And we can really just leave these message templates for both the email and the in-app, because this is still sending an invoice was updated messaging. So now I'm going to go ahead and commit this to development. I'm going to go ahead and work back out. I'm going to promote my changes to production. And now let's give this another shot. Again, what we're going to do is we're going to test a few different scenarios. First of all, let's just change or test changing it to something that's not paid, just to make sure that that works. So I'm going to change the status, first of all, to uncollectible, and let's see what kind of notifications we get. And we can see that something popped into my notifications. We can see that it was changed to uncollectible. Looking at my email, I only received an email to the user account here. So we didn't receive one to the payee in this case. But now I'm going to go ahead and change this to paid, of course, where I can see another notification popped in. This time it was paid. I can see the notification where that invoice was paid from the user perspective. And I can also see from the payee's perspective where I see your invoice was paid and you get that message. Now, again, taking this up to another level, what if when these updates are made, I'm making a bunch of different changes? I'm changing it to all the different statuses, maybe accidentally, maybe I'm just like fumbling through that, but whatever it is, maybe those status changes were made too much. I don't want to send a new email for every single one. So can I control it and maybe group it and send all of them together? So let's actually look inside of edit steps here, where we have another one called batch that we can use. And it's going to do just that, where let me drag this into, let's just update this for the not paid, where it's going to be the updates, where I can say that I have a fixed duration of 5 minutes, where anything that's sent within those 5 minutes, I'm going to batch into one specific message, where we can see that we also have different ways of doing this. Maybe we can do dynamic intervals that are based off of the data that we're passing through, but it just gives you a lot of flexibility for how you create these new batch steps in order to really control how you want to send these different messages. But in my case, I just want to have it batch within these 5 minutes, a little bit of a simpler use case. And I'm only going to batch those so that when I send these to the user updates, they're going to be grouped into that single email. Now, the one thing is when we do send these updates, we need to update the template a little bit based off of that batching. So I'm going to go ahead and head over to this message template. And inside of my editor, I'm going to get rid of this markdown branch here. Let me go ahead and remove this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an HTML block for this, where I'm going to pop this open. I'm going to paste this in. What we're going to do is when we have the batch notifications going on, we're going to have access to this variable of total activities, where I'm going to say if the total activities is greater than 1, I'm going to loop through all the activities that I have available and add a new list item for each of those. Otherwise, if I only have one total activity, I'm going to just send that original change status. Now, I changed this to an HTML block to make sure that I have the proper formatting for when I have my unordered list, as it gets a little bit more unwieldy when I'm working with the different ifs, the liquid templating along with the HTML. So this is just a little bit more easier to reason about. So now I'm going to have that dynamic messaging sent based off of whether it was just that one or if it has a big batch of changes. So let me also update the subject. So let's say some invoices were updated, probably can have some better messaging than that, but I have that saved. And notice here that we're only putting this if it's not paid. If it's paid, we're going to message every time because we want to know when an invoice was paid. But if it's just a regular status, we can batch those a little bit. But you can think of this as a good way to create different scenarios for how you want to send messages, where maybe you use this to send time-based intervals, such as sending reminders. Maybe when an invoice is created, you want to wait maybe 10 days after or 10 days before the due date to send a reminder to make sure that it's updated. And you want to also check the status. Maybe by that time that step runs, you can make sure that status doesn't equal paid before sending that reminder. But either way, you have a lot of different tools here through these different step functions to give you an ability to craft and really send that exactly when you want it to. But let's go ahead and commit this to development as we usually do. I'm going to go ahead and publish this to production, where now I'm going to go ahead and just spam these updates so that we can see if this works. So I'm going to go ahead and change these statuses. Let's change it to open, void, uncollectible. I'm going to change it to open and void again. Now, if you notice, we haven't received any notifications yet, and that's really the point, right? But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that 5 minutes, let me go ahead and change this to paid. Now we should see that this paid notification came in right away. So if I click this, we can already see that the invoice was paid and the email came along in the background as well. But we still didn't get those updates before. We got that paid first, but it hasn't quite been 5 minutes yet. Now, once it has been 5 minutes, I can head to my inbox and I should be able to see the full list of all those updates that I made to that invoice. Now, this is working really great, and I'm sure you can imagine how many different use cases you could use for being able to really craft exactly what you want to do with these different notifications between who you send it to, when you send it. But there's one important thing that we want to do to make sure that we always have the most up-to-date data inside of our Knock account, and that's making sure that we're syncing that user data based off of our authentication provider. Now, one of the nice things that comes along with your Clerk account, or really probably most of the auth providers that you have, is the ability to use webhooks. And what we can do is anytime we listen to specific events, we can update that knock information. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen for session created, or when someone logs in, we're going to look for a user created and a user updated so that we can always make sure that we have that updated information. So let's go ahead and create our first webhook. So inside of Clerk, I'm going to go ahead and create a new endpoint. And here is where we're going to have to actually enter our endpoint URL. So that means back inside of our application, we need to actually create a new endpoint. So inside of app, I'm going to create an API directory. I'm going to create a webhooks folder. That way we can just keep organized all of our different webhooks. And I'm going to call this a knock directory. So it's going to be /API/webhook/knock. And then I'm going to create my route.ts file. So that means that my endpoint is going to be /API/webhooks/knock, and we'll have a domain to test with in a little bit here. Of course, we can't use localhost here because that's only for our environment. And in the future, in the production, we're going to have it the actual host for wherever we're deploying this to, but we want to have a way to test this locally for a minute. So we'll come back to this. Now, as far as the webhooks is concerned, Clerk has a really nice tutorial in their documentation for walking through exactly what you need to do in order to set up, but there's a little bit of an easier way to do that. Brian Morrison, who works at Clerk, created this little library that makes it much easier to work with webhooks inside of a Next.js application. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually install this and use that in order to create our different event listeners. So first, I'm going to copy the npm install command, paste that into my terminal, and then actually install it. And then if we head to the documentation, we can see that first of all, we need to create this webhook secret. We're going to do that in a second, but then we can see this usage example. So I'm going to just copy this as is and paste it into my route.ts. And we can see that this is going to give me basically the existing structure of how I want to create this endpoint, where it creates a new event handler, a new post endpoint. It gives me access to this create webhooks handler, and then all the different events that I want to actually access. We can even see that on session created and on user updated are two of the ones that we want to actually use. The only other one that we want to have is on user created. Now, as we can see that we're actually getting some TypeScript errors from the user JSON and session data, we're going to be importing these directly from Clerk itself, and we can see that the errors go away. But what we're going to do inside of each of these is we're going to use the identify endpoint from Knock, where we're going to trigger these in each one based off of the data that we have to make sure that we update that. So I'm going to copy over our Knock configuration that we had from inside of our server actions, similar to just like what we did before, because we'll be working in a server environment. But this time, again, we're going to be using the identify. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in this snippet here, where we can see what we're doing is we're using the identify method. I'm going to pass in the payload.id, which that ID is going to be based off of the user that's getting this onCreated event kicked off for. So this is going to ultimately be the user ID that we're identifying. We're going to get that first name from Clerk, and we're also going to get the email addresses, just like we saw when we were firing that trigger method. Now we're going to actually do the same exact thing for the updated method. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this as is, because we want to send the same information to make sure that we have everything up to date, whether it's our name, email, and any other information that you're taking from Clerk and want to pass into Knock. Now, the one that's going to be a little bit different though is this on session created, where we're ultimately going to want to send over our identify method here, but we don't have all the same information. This payload is going to be different. This is going to be this session payload. It doesn't have all that user information, but it does pass in our user ID. Now, in order to get the user object, we're going to take that user ID and we're going to get it from Clerk. So what we're going to do is up inside of our Clerk import, we're going to import the Clerk client, and that's a capital C. And then under on session created, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get that user, where we're going to use the Clerk client.users.getUser method in order to get where we're passing in that user ID, which will pass back that user object for us. But then we have that user object that we can start to use. So all we need to do now is update this payload to user.firstname, user.email addresses, And of course, we want to make sure that we update the payload ID because the ID isn't going to be representative of the user. This is the session object that has the ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the payload.user ID in order to pass that into the identify method. Now, when we're accessing this data, the properties are going to be a little bit different here. We're going to have camel case for first name, and we're going to have camel case for email addresses as well. And as you can expect, that extends to all the different properties. So we're going to have primary email address as camel case, as well as our email address. And then as we can see here, because we no longer have the payload primary email address ID, we want to make sure that this is the user primary email address ID. But that should be all the configuration needed in order to make sure our on session created gets the same information to be able to pass into the identify endpoint. But what this is going to allow us to do is anytime one of these events happen, we're going to make sure we have the most up-to-date information from Clerk, because that's going to be basically the source of truth where we're going to sync it up to Knock, where Knock can use it anytime it's communicating with any of the users. But now let's actually test this out. In order to test this out, we're going to use ngrok, which is going to allow us to spin up a new local server that's going to be publicly accessible. Now, if you head over to ngrok.com, it's going to make you sign up for an account, but what it's going to allow us to do is get access to a free domain that's going to be publicly accessible. So if I click create domain here, we're going to see it's going to give us a line that we're going to need to paste into our terminal. If this is the first time needing to install ngrok, it's going to give you the information if you click this link, but I'm going to go ahead and just copy this since I had already installed it before. I'm going to actually paste this into a new tab in my terminal where we can see at the end here, this port of 80, we need to actually change this to the port that our application is running on, which for Next.js is by default 3000. So I'm going to run this. But now if I start to open up this URL, we can see that that's not the actual URL. Let me open this in a full tab. We can see that it's going to give me this salmon sound primate. I'm going to visit this site. And once it loads, we can see that I get my Invoicepedia application. So now I have this publicly accessible. So just to test this out, let's go to /API/webhooks/knock. And we can see that it's not working. It's getting a 405, but that's because that it's not representative of that GET request. But now I'm going to take this URL, I'm going to head back to Clerk, and I'm going to paste this into my endpoint for my webhook. And now I can finally finish configuring that webhook. So we're going to go down to the different events that are available, and I'm going to look for session created, and I'm going to also look for user created and user updated. Now, once we have those selected, we want to do one more thing, and that's actually just create our webhook. Now, once our webhook is created, importantly, we want to grab our signing secret like we saw before. So this is going to be the value that we want to pass into our environment variable. So inside of the GitHub documentation for Brian Morrison's webhooks handler library, we can see we want to call this webhook secret as a default value. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in my webhook secret, actually copy that value, paste that into my .env.local. Now, in order to test this, you're able to go into the webhook configuration page inside of Clerk, where you have this testing tab where you can send test payloads based off of the different event that you want to do. Now, when you're working through the different endpoints and you're creating them, that's a great way to make sure that that code that we were pasting in earlier is actually working and running. But I'm going to just go ahead and test this into the application just for the sake of this tutorial, where the way that this is going to work is I already have my user synced into Clerk from logging in the first place. So how can we test that that's going to get synced where all that information is already up to date? So what we can actually do is we can just create a new user and log in with a different account to make sure that that's going to be actually synced in with the user before we do anything like create an invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and log out of my existing account. And then I'm going to go ahead and log in with Google into a different Gmail that I have. And now that I'm logged into this other account where this is cosmospacejelly@gmail.com, nothing crazy, we can now look inside of the users table and we can see not only the original account, the payee, but we now see that new account that I just logged in. It was synced as soon as I created that new account. But ultimately, this is going to be a great way in order to listen to the different events that might update the data outside of the scope of our application to make sure that Knock is always up to date with the latest and greatest. Now, I think we got all the notifications down, but next up, let's see how we can dynamically generate calendar links to add that reminder to their calendar.